Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ruth Ronan. I am a senior instructional designer in the Teaching and Learning with Technology department. On behalf of the Rutgers University Online Learning Conference, I am delighted to introduce you to Goretti Vinuales, a doctoral candidate in curriculum and instruction at George Washington University, as well as an elementary school teacher. We are pleased to have her present the first of two 25-minute presentations in this particular room. During the presentation, please use the live Q&A to ask any questions of the presenter, and we will have a period at the end where we'll address your questions. You can also use the discussion forum just for more informal conversations. And at the end of each presentation today, there will be a short survey displayed. Any feedback you can provide is greatly appreciated. Now I'll hand it over to Goretti.
Thank you, Ruth. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for being here today. My name is Goretti Vinuales. I'm a doctoral candidate in curriculum and instruction at George Washington University. And for the last 6 years, I've taught in Spanish immersion classrooms and in English-Spanish bilingual classrooms. I'm going to share my presentation now. Share screen. Okay. So 1 year ago, I never could have imagined that I'd be teaching my elementary school students from my living room. But during this past year, the pandemic has transformed the way I teach, and I've had to learn strategies for online teaching my students and for keeping my students motivated behind their computers. So today I'm sharing these strategies for teaching online in bilingual and immersion elementary classrooms. My purpose today is that by the end of this presentation, you are able to create online lessons for K-5 learners in dual language and immersion context, to use online tools to promote students' comprehension and production in the target language, and to create online learning instructional materials to promote creativity and improve learners' target language proficiency. The outline for this presentation is going to be the following. First, I'll briefly explain what language immersion programs are, like the main characteristics of these programs. And then I'll talk about the strategies to support learning in bilingual and immersion classrooms and how we can adapt these strategies to online context. I'll move to talk about the principles of multimedia learning and how we can apply this multimedia learning theory and principles to online learning context to plan effective instructional materials and online lessons. So most of the strategies that I'm going to talk about today apply to both monolingual traditional classrooms and to immersion and bilingual classrooms. The difference, I would say, is that in more traditional in-person monolingual classrooms, these strategies would be advisable, but in immersion and bilingual classrooms, these strategies are a must. They are absolutely necessary. And this is because in language immersion programs and classrooms, the student population consists of majority language speakers with limited to no proficiency in the immersion or minority language. And here on the right margin, you can read the definitions. Minority language is language other than the one spoken by the majority of people in a given regional or national context. And the majority language is the language spoken by the majority of people in a given regional or national context. So in my case, since I teach in Spanish immersion classrooms, the target language and or the minority language would be Spanish, and the majority language in my case would be English. So I'm going to move on now to the strategies. I'm going to talk about 5 strategies to support learning in bilingual and immersion classrooms. The first one is providing a structured learning environment. So a consistent and very clear structured learning environment. It's very important to keep students engaged and focused. Students in immersion classrooms, as I said, many times don't understand all the words that the teachers are saying. So having this consistency, these recurring activities, and starting the same way or ending our lessons the same way, helps them get focused and to know what to expect and to kind of like figure out what these activities are about. So, for example, how we can adapt this strategy, how can we adapt this strategy to online context? So one way is by starting and ending our lessons with a recurring activity. It can be a song, maybe with our youngest students, or a recurring activity, starting our lessons with virtual morning assembly, or by sharing the goal of the lessons, and, for example, ending our lessons with what did you learn today, or what activity did you enjoy the most in today's lesson? And I'm going to give some examples of activities that I use. For example, with my 3rd to 5th grade students, I usually start my lessons talking about the date and sometimes about the weather. And I always start my lessons with a question in which I am asking students something about themselves. For example, in this one, I would ask, ¿Qué te gusta hacer en tu tiempo libre? Which means, what do you like to do in your free time? And I would give my students like a few words. How can we answer this question? So I help them by giving them this structure. I think this question can be answered by starting a sentence saying, en mi tiempo libre me gusta, in my free time I like to, and I would probably give them a couple of examples. Another activity that I do sometimes at the beginning of my lessons is this one. I have 6 questions, and I share this link with my students in the chat. And so taking turns, they roll the dice. This is a link to an app where you can roll a dice, and then I ask them to tell me the number they got and to learn to read the question and to answer that question. These are kind of like the type of questions that I usually use. So these are some examples of how to provide this structured learning environment. The next strategy is to build background. So building background is very, very important in all classrooms, monolingual, bilingual, but in bilingual classrooms is absolutely essential. So how can we do that in online context? A way I do that is by using online whiteboards, as, for example, Jamboard. And at the end of this presentation, I included a link to all these apps and software that I use in my online lessons and some links to some tutorials. So another way to build background is by asking a question to our students, or showing a picture, an illustration, and asking them to write in the chat words that come to their mind when they see that picture. Another way is by using KWL collaborative charts, using Google Slides, or sometimes I also use prior knowledge assessments. I use online quizzes, for example, with this software that I really like. It's called Quizzes. And so prior knowledge, it's absolutely, to build prior knowledge is absolutely important in bilingual classroom, because as educational psychologist, Dr. Richard Mayer says, prior knowledge is the single most important individual difference dimension in instructional design. If you could know just one thing about the learner, you would want to know the learner's prior knowledge in the domain. So it's really important. And as I said, Some of the activities that I do in my lessons to activate students' prior knowledge are these. For example, this I would use an online whiteboard, and I would give my students a picture, and then they can add sticky notes with words they come to their mind when they look at this picture. Here I have these questions: ¿Qué ves? ¿Qué piensas? Which means, what do you see and what do you think when you see these pictures? And these are some of the examples that my students gave. I see 4 trees, or here I see leaves of different colors. I see changes. I see different colors, or I see a blue sky. These are the key WL charts that in Spanish could be SQA charts, because it stands for lo que sé, what I know, what I would like to know, what I would like to learn, lo que quiero saber, and lo que aprendí, what I learned. So we would complete the first 2 columns, for example, before starting a unit. In this case, it was about Groundhog Day. And this was another activity that I used to activate my students' prior knowledge for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I used this chart where students and myself, we talk about what we know about who was Dr. Martin Luther King, what did he have, and what did he do. And so the next strategy would be to maximizing output. So in immersion and bilingual classrooms, we have to give our students as many opportunities to practice the target language, in my case, Spanish. And in my case, my groups, my classes are a small group, so it's kind of like easier to give students all students the opportunity to practice and to practice the language. But when we have more students, we can do breakout rooms, and I usually include a lot of activities where students have to give presentations. They can share their screen and give presentations. And also for my assignments, for my homework, I use this software called Flipgrid, where students can record themselves reading a text or answering a question. So the last 2 strategies are providing adequate comprehensible input and using scaffolding techniques. For example, to provide adequate comprehensible input, I would use a lot of visuals in my presentations. I would try to present vocabulary and grammar always in context. And for the assignments, I would record myself explaining the assignments and the homework. And about the scaffolding techniques, we've talked a little bit about this. I make sure that I do some activities to activate students' prior knowledge and try to connect the content with my students' experiences and prior knowledge. I use a lot of cognates, use a lot of slides with graphic organizers, visuals, word banks, grammatical structures. And I'm going to show you a few examples on how I do this. Because to provide adequate comprehensible input and scaffolding techniques, we need to know how learning happens. And for that, I always use the multimedia learning theory. So the multimedia principle states that people learn better from words and pictures than from words alone. And this theory proposes 3 main assumptions. The first assumption is that the dual coding assumptions. There are 2 separate channels for processing information, auditory and visual. So learners can take advantage of these 2 separate channels. So they can choose relevant images to work with and relevant words to work with, and they can organize this information to make a model that works the best for them and that helps them understand the material. The second assumption is the limited capacity assumption. So each channel has a limited capacity for processing information. And the third assumption is the active processing assumption, which says that learning is an active process of selecting, organizing, and integrating information based upon prior knowledge. So how do I apply these principles of multimedia learning to my online lessons? First, I try to combine visual information, pictures, videos, charts, or printed words with auditory information, with spoken words in a narration. It's usually me talking at the same time as I show these slides. Also, because of the limited capacity assumption, I try to not to overwhelm students with information, and by limiting the amount of text on slides, by using very simple pictures and clear spoken narrations. And also, very importantly, I include cues that direct students' attention to important material. And I'm going to show you a few examples of some of the materials I use, I create using these principles. Because of the last multimedia learning assumption, the active processing assumption, I try to encourage students' active processing by using visual structures that guide students' cognitive processes and help them build mental models. So this is one of the examples of how I apply multimedia learning theory to my online lessons. With my youngest students, I usually start my lessons by talking about how's the weather like today. So I ask them, ¿Cómo está el tiempo hoy? And then I would say, hace sol, está nublado, llueve, hay tormenta o nieva. And then I would repeat again, hace sol, está nublado, llueve, hay tormenta o nieva. Then I would ask them, ¿hace frío o hace calor? So then I would ask them, so ¿cómo está el tiempo hoy? Hace sol, está nublado, llueve, hay tormenta o nieva. And then when they would answer that question, I would write their answer here. And then I would ask them, so is it hot or is it cold? In this case, hace calor. So I would write that part of the answer here. And then I would ask them, so ¿cómo está el tiempo hoy? I would give them this clear structure. So how did I plan this instructional material? So first, I used visual and auditory channels. I didn't use too much text on the slides, and I used simple pictures and clear spoken narrations. And I also add this, I duplicate the slides. So when I move throughout the slides, I can match my spoken words with the visuals, and I can direct my students' attention to the important information. As I said, I would use the 2 channels. I wouldn't use too much text on my slides, and I would use simple pictures, clear spoken narrations, and visual structures that help students processing information. Another example, for example, this is teaching math, would be, in this case, I would be, for example, teaching número anterior y posterior. And I would, to scaffold their learning, I would use this 100 chart here with the color, the number that goes before 26 and the number that goes after 26. I would use the same colors here. And as I'm explaining, I would say, okay, what number comes before 26? And I would use that arrow, and I would, so that arrow would match my narration. And what number comes after 26? And so they would say 27. And again, in this activity, students would have visual information and auditory information. Again, I didn't use too much text. I would use a clear spoken narration. And I would use visual structures that help students processing information. In this case, I would use the arrows and the different colors to signal important information. And finally, this is another example. This is for older students. So before reading a text, I would always, when texts are a little bit more complex, I would make sure to go over vocabulary that my students may struggle with and to talk about this vocabulary. I would include a word bank here, and we would talk about different.
Goretti, we have 5 minutes left, but you can continue. We don't have any questions.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. So I would talk about these words, and then before reading the text, and then my students would read the text. So again, using multimedia learning principles and assumptions, I would make sure to include graphics and to use these 2 different channels and to use visual structures that help my students processing information. So these are some tools that I like to use for my online lessons. Jamboard, quizzes, Bingo Baker. This is an app that you can use to create bingo cards. And I use those also for example, for reviewing numbers, or I use, instead of numbers, I create bingo cards that include different words, and I use that to activate students' prior knowledge as well. I also use Flipgrid and Edpuzzle. So since this presentation is going to be recorded, if you're interested, you can go back here and check them out. And so I would like to finish this presentation by reading this quote by George Couros, which says that technology will not replace great teachers, but technology in the hands of great teachers can be transformational. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
There are no questions at this time, but I have a question.
Okay.
I'm wondering, I'm a big believer of multimedia learning and all that, and it has a lot of similarities with universal design for learning. Have you also, incorporated universal design for learning principles into your planning?
Sorry, what is the question?
Universal design for learning, UDL. But it's very similar to multimedia learning. So I was just wondering if, it looks like you're applying a lot of the similar principles is what's noticed. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I use usually like the multimedia learning principles, and that's so it's you mean that it has a lot of in common with universal
design for learning? Yes, it does.
Thank you.